welcome everybody to another free lecture here at the Rocky Mountain School of Photography. My name is Andy Benson. This is Doug Johnson, one of our RMSP instructors. Many of you know him. Doug is going to be talking to us tonight about creating pleasing HDR images, which I'm actually really excited for because he's good at it. So, as always, YouTube, thank you for joining us. And for any of you who have questions, please leave them in the comments below. Sarah is in the back. She'll be answering them as we go through the lecture. And the biggest thing, thank you B&H Photo Video for providing the microphone for this entire, to make this possible. Otherwise, none of you could hear us. So everybody enjoy. Have a good night.
Thank you, Andy. Appreciate that. And thanks you guys for coming. Did you enjoy the day?
Yes.
Amazing. That little bit of spring is heading our way. I'm going to ask you guys a few questions first because I want to know a little bit about you as an audience. So that I can sort of direct some of the content towards those questions. But then during the program, you can ask me questions. I encourage that for sure. And some people in the audience, the YouTube audience, will be asking questions as well. So we'll answer those so that everybody can hear what's going on. And so to begin with, I'd like to ask you guys, what about HDR? I mean, some of this program we're going to be discussing that specifically, but have you used it? How many people have used HDR in a program? How many people know nothing about it? All right. Well, you're going to be entertained, and certainly you're going to be excited about the possibilities. And some of you that have used it before, you're going to be able to maybe pick up a few tips so that you can produce pleasing HDR images, which is the title of this lecture. But pleasing, what does that mean? Because pleasing is a little bit subjective, isn't it? So what does pleasing mean?
It means not overdone.
Overdone, that's exactly right. It doesn't appear that the HDR process has produced something that is out of this world sort of look. And that's where my intent is to go there, is to go to a place that's realistic. And so that's what I'm going to do during this lecture. But in terms of the lecture, why, for those of you that have used HDR, why do we use it? Why is it such a valuable tool as a photographer these days? What's the purpose?
See what your eye can see.
And what does that mean? Because we can...
The dynamic range, our brain is amazing when it stitches it together, so we can see dynamic range, which a camera traditionally couldn't.
Yeah, so we can sort of categorize the solution of HDR under the umbrella of high contrast, right? High contrast, so that you can't capture all of what you see in one photograph when you have high contrast situations, like in the morning when the sky is illuminated with beautiful clouds, but your landscape or something in the foreground is dark, right? You can only expose for one thing. So we're going to be talking about that in terms of the solutions for high contrast. And then we'll get into the HDR piece at the end, because realistically, HDR is not that difficult. It is easy. The capture is the most difficult part to make sure that you have the images. And we'll talk about that, how to capture the images for HDR and then how to process so they look realistic. How does that sound? Good? Everybody on board? All right, I'm going to turn off the lights, I think. And I know how to do that. There's one switch over here. And how's the light here for everybody? Good? All right. So the problem in photography in terms of high contrast goes back a very long time, since the beginning of photography. And Gustave Le Gray was a black and white photographer. There was no color at that point. But he also recognized that the film could not capture high contrast in some situations. And so what he did as a photographer in the black and white negative and printing days is he took two negatives and then printed from those two negatives on one sheet of paper. Have you ever tried that, Herb?
Yes.
Extremely difficult.
But I've never done it with what collodion as Gustav was.
Oh yeah, that's what throws another wrench into the whole thing. But he was very, very good at it. And so he became very popular back in the mid-1800s. And there's another picture of his. You can see all the detail in the shadow and highlights. And there's another gentleman back in the days of film shooting transparencies that also recognized, he's a landscape photographer, adventure photographer, and he recognized that the beautiful times of day was a really challenge in terms of the contrast. He couldn't get it on film, on slide film. So what did he develop? Does anybody know? The split neutral density filter. And so he blocked out some of the parts of the frame up here to make it dark, and then allowed the exposure to come through here. So he brought the contrast range together. And he became really, really popular for that, and he produced some amazing images. But I think what he did is overdo it a little bit occasionally, because basically you could never have this kind of light on the foreground with the sun just coming up or setting in the background. And so that's what we're going to attempt to do when we talk about, well, I'm going to discuss splits for a minute this evening, but once we get into HDR, you're going to keep that in mind. You want to keep the range of contrast in such so that your shadows appear to be shadows, and the things that are in light appear to be in light, like they should be, properly exposed. And my friend Allison Shaw, who has some galleries on Martha's Vineyard, she used her checkbook to bring the contrast together. So she would put a little piece of tape on her lens and basically block the light, feather it like this, and she got really good at it. I tried it a few times and I'm like, forget this. I'm going to use my splits. But she didn't want to buy those expensive filters, so she used her checkbook, which is pretty amazing. Some people ask, can we compromise? Can we create an exposure in between an exposure for the highlight and shadows to manage things? What's the answer? No, because then you get crappy highlights and you also get crappy shadows. Not very good. So how do we know that we have an exposure limitation, meaning that we're outside of the latitude? How do we know that?
Light meter.
A meter. A meter in your camera, right? The histogram, exactly. Those are the two biggest things. So let's look at the histogram really quickly. This is after the picture was taken, and you can see in this on the back of this LCD on a camera, you can see the histogram right here. And this histogram, conveniently enough, is showing that the highlights are clipped. Do you see that? So he's struggling to get all the detail in the shadow and highlights in that shot. Or our cameras these days have what in them that we can do it in real time. Live view. So you have a histogram in live view that you can also look at, and this is the back of a camera too that shows the LCD, and it has a live view mode where you can actually see the histogram before you take the picture. Super valuable. But I want to talk about the histogram only because it's going to be really important in what we're discussing tonight. And so how many people in here have never seen their histogram on their camera? So everybody has. Never have. All right, well, you're going to have to stop by the school and just stop in and say, hey, anybody here can show me my histogram? You don't have your camera here tonight, do you? Okay. Anyway, it's a little info button in live view that you press. This would bring up the histogram in live view right here, this little info button. But play around and you'll find it. Read your manual, you'll get there. But let's talk about the histogram because it's so important. And the histogram shows us our exposure. Basically, it shows us the distribution of tones or the latitude of what we can capture. And this histogram here is 4 rectangular boxes. Some of them look a little bit different than that. But basically, on the left here is pure black. At the very edge of the histogram over here is pure black. Over on the right here, pure white. And everything in between those values, right? And this is a Nikon histogram. Like I said, every histogram is not the same. Canon has a histogram that looks like this. Your Sony, your Olympus might look a little bit different as well, but they all show the same thing. And so let's put something in this histogram and talk about it. This shows us our distribution of latitude. And here on the left, look, there's no gap in between the edge of the histogram and what's being shown or represented. And that means that you have lost detail here in the blacks. So these are blacks. But anyway, if we look at the overall histogram, the average tones are where you would expect them to be, right in the middle, right? If you go to the left, those become darker. And how much darker are these tones than these? Just knowing what our metering system does. These are one stop darker. If you go over here, these are very dark, approaching black towards the edge. How much darker? One stop. So there's 2 stops difference between the average tones in the middle and all the way over here on the left. If you go to the other side, and then like I said, if the histogram is up against the wall, meaning there's no gap, that means that you've lost detail in the blacks. Is everybody with me so far? Okay. So on the other side, if you go from the average towards the right, you get lighter. How much lighter? One stop. You go even further, very light, 2 stops. Exactly right. So you're approaching what tone over here? White, exactly. White and black. Perfect. And of course, so here would be a histogram where the histogram is buried over to the left, all the way up on the wall. So what is happening in this photograph? What are you losing?
Black detail.
Yeah, black detail. So somewhere in this photograph, possibly over here, somewhere in there, you're losing detail in the blacks. What else is happening here, which is a little difficult to see, but you're also clipping or losing detail in a few white pixels. Because look at, they're climbing the wall over here, just a little bit. So here would be a histogram where you have significantly clipped the highlights, right? So those are lighter, and they get lighter yet, and then you have white with no detail if you don't have a gap between here and what's represented in the wall or the side of the histogram. Everybody with me? Okay. So here would be an example of an exposure for this scene of snow where the whites have been clipped, meaning no detail in the whites. Everybody with me? Okay. All right, so we'll be talking about the histogram throughout this presentation, so I just wanted to give you a quick introduction to what that is. But we can also say, like Herb said just a minute ago, we can meter. We can use our metering system as opposed to just taking a shot and looking at the histogram and adjusting. We can basically meter things. So if I put my spot meter up here in the brighter area of the photograph, the highlight, and basically expose that, here it's a +1.5 on the metering system, using here manually metering or exposure compensation in aperture, shutter, or program priority. So we've exposed for the highlight. But if we look at and now point our little spot meter in the shadows, and basically we see that it's going further than -2, with a little arrow that indicates that we are underexposed, you know before you take the picture that what's going to happen. You are going to lose detail in the shadows, right? So you could meter first, you could take the picture and adjust, and then look at the histogram to make sure that you're getting proper exposure for the highlight or shadow, and then look and see if you're losing detail in the highlights or shadows. But if we understand that in high contrast like this, that we are going to lose something, we can't get everything in the shot, then basically we have to think about the 7 solutions for high contrast that we can put in our sort of mental tool bag. And so one of the 7 solutions is better exposure. The other one is better light, number 2. Certainly you could recompose to remove the area that's giving you problems. You could use a split neutral density filter, and I'll discuss those briefly. You can paint with light. Use a flash. Use a flashlight, right? A lot of people do that at night to, they get exposure for the ambient light to say of, a street light or something, and then the object that they want to light up, they have to use flash or paint with light to get the contrast in a better range. We can also process in camera. How many people have used this in their cameras? And how did it work for you? Worked pretty good? Great. Anybody else have experience with that?
The iPhone does it now automatically, unless you turn it off, it goes HDR automatically now.
Yeah, they have an HDR mode. Phones have, they have a lot of HDR cameras that you can buy too, in terms of apps that have the HDR function as well. Yes. But then you can merge in software, and that's what we're going to be talking about mainly tonight, is using the HDR outside of the camera, not in the camera, to produce better flexibility. What happens when you use HDR in camera? What do you get out of that? You get
What it's going to give you.
What it's going to give you is a JPEG file. So that doesn't have as much flexibility as the RAW file, which we'll discuss here in a minute. Okay, so the first one, better exposure. And this has mainly to do with RAW files. And this is a technique that you can manage the contrast a little bit better. So if we look at this photograph, I metered for the light out here, and then took the picture. And our histogram here is, it's not outside of the range of possibilities in terms of the exposure. It's not super high contrast. But what happens if you go and you want to work on this in post-processing and you bring out the really heavy shadows in terms of the detail in those shadows? You can barely see them now. What is produced when you do that? Absolutely, you get lots of noise depending on how heavy or dark that shadow is. So but you have flexibility here in terms of your exposure. So how many people shoot RAW in here? So almost everybody. A few JPEG shooters. But take that into account. This is for RAW shooters mainly, but you can get a better exposure. And here's why you get noise when you do this. Here's the histogram for that particular shot. This is a tone map for the histogram for a 14-bit file, which is the RAW file. And you can see there's 16,000 tone levels. Well, most of the tonal levels are up here in the brighter area of the photographs, meaning the levels of tones. Down here, there's not very many at all. So when you brighten up that shadow, basically, it starts to fall apart, and that's where you get the noise. So we can create a better exposure for this by doing this, creating a brighter exposure. Take this exposure that we talked about and create a bright one. And now our shadows we haven't clipped anything. You can see that in terms of the highlight. We're just creating a better exposure for the shadows. And if we take that histogram and put it on the histogram in terms of the tone map, you can see that now our shadow is not down here, but it has 2048 levels of tones. So now you have lots more information to process the file with. So that's something to consider when you're seeing relatively high contrast, is to brighten up the exposure so you get more stuff, right? There's our shadow now. So now I can basically do that, create a brighter, better photograph. Here's another example just shot in the Tetons. Exposed for, the brightness up here. And here's my highlight out here on the right side of the histogram, but look at the shadow. So if I wanted to do anything with this, once again, you'd produce noise. So you can move it a little bit, brighten it up, open up the exposure, add a little bit more light. So here's a second exposure, and the shadow's a little bit brighter, and so that's an advantage. You you can add more information and then have more flexibility to play. So does that make sense, raw shooters, why you'd want to do that? Especially when you're starting to push the contrast towards, really deep shadows. All right, so now we can move along to, waiting for better light. That's always an option, certainly. So if Cartman can wait for better light, then we can too. So it would just be a matter of waiting for light, right? Or we can recompose, a third solution to high contrast. So here, obviously, if we expose for the highlight, our shadows are all blocked up. And so we can expose for what's important. And that's down in the stream area there. And just remove the area that was giving you a problem. So here's another example of that. Exposed for the shadows here, but the highlights are too bright. So all the contrast is up here. So just minimize the contrast by recomposing. So that's our fourth solution. Here's another example of that out at 9 pipes, but just too much black. So just remove it by recomposing.
Can you go back?
Yeah. See, it's just lots of black here. So, it's still high contrast, but you lessen the effect. Like you don't get sucked into those shadows, right? Yeah, so it's always something that I have in my mind. It's like, ooh, can I recompose and make this better without having to do anything else? And certainly sometimes that works. And graduated neutral density filters. So these are called split neutral density filters, and they're rectangular. Don't buy the circular ones. But you can see they have density to part of the filter so that basically it blocks some of the light where the brightness would be, and you expose for the shadows, right? And they come in hard transitions, soft transitions, and they also come in 1, 2, and 3 stop densities. So you have some flexibility in terms of how high the contrast is. You can use different filters, and they're expensive. The Stingray is the top shelf split neutral density filters, and they run about $160 a piece. But if you were to buy just a couple, I think that would be the way to go, because then you're only buying 2. And the ones I'd suggest is a 2-stop soft and a 1-stop hard, because then you could combine them to make 3 stops. And the 1-stop hard is subtle enough so that you don't notice it. So you could use it in more situations compared to the 2-stop. And they go in a filter holder. Coke and P makes the holder for these Stingray filters. And then the filter goes onto an adapter ring, and then those go onto the front of the lens. And some people don't like to use the filter holder because it's kind of a pain. So I've always used just my hand and held the filter out in front of the lens. But these filters, you can tilt them, you can put them upside down, and this filter holder just allows you to not have to hang on to the filter. That's all. But let's look and see an appropriate way to use these so that they look like what you see and not like Galen Rao did in a lot of his pictures. This is too bright. This photograph is too bright in the foreground. It doesn't match. The light is just coming up. It should look like this. We want to keep the shadow as a shadow. And so let's find out how to do that. Here's a really extreme example. And so the way that you do this in the field in terms of determining which filter you use is first you have to meter the highlight. And so if there's we're looking through the camera here, here's our little meter. And if we use our spot meter again, and spot meter that little area of the brightest of the picture where it's pure white, and just go to +2 on that, it gives us a shutter speed of 1/30th of a second. And just keep that in your mind. You're not going to expose the frame at 1/30th. It's just a reference for the split that you use. So now we got to meter the shadow. And here's the key. If you meter the shadow, you don't want to properly expose the shadow because this is green grass. But if you zero out your camera for something that's average tone like green grass, the green grass is going to be what? Very bright. So you want to basically take this down a little bit, and -1, it would still have lots of detail in it, but it's going to feel like a shadow when you expose for it. Is everybody with me? And so now we know which filter to pull out of our bag. Because if we start at a 30th and we go to a 4th, how many stops is that? Three stops. So we pull out our 3-stop filter and we shoot at a 1/4 of a second, and our exposure looks like this. And now it's properly exposed. Yeah, and that looks good. So let's try this again. Just walk through it one more time. Here we need to meter what? Highlight, yeah, meter the cloud and open up 2, right? White cloud, 2 stops, get a 60th of a second. So now let's meter the foreground here. And I just put my meter right on that rock, and this time I only took it down a 1/2 stop. Or no, I did took it down a full stop in this situation too. And so here our shutter speed is a 15th of a second. So what's the difference? We had a 60th and a 15th. 2 stops. So now we can pull our 2-stop filter out of our bag, and it just runs right through here. And now we've got the proper exposure. We base our exposure off of this, our shadow, and we meter for the highlight to determine which filter we use. Did that help for you who have splits? Of how you might maybe approach it different in the future, maybe? Okay. And then we can also use flash. And here, pretty dark exposure on the trees, and I just brought in a little flash and bounced it off a big reflector to add some light. And that was on camera. This is just bounced warm off camera with a cord, my flash, bounced off a big reflector. Here's just painting with light. So I just added light to this, and then when it walked out there and added light to the rock. So that's another option. In this shot, I allowed a car to paint the light. In a storm that was over Death Valley, you can see the stars up there. But this adds the interest that you need, right? Just the painting with light there. And then the 5th solution, I think, processing in camera. And this can do pretty well. I think in terms of my Nikon, I've noticed that it does okay. It doesn't do a great job. I think only because there's only 2 exposures involved. Canon actually does 3 exposures for the HDR. So, you know, from what I've read and what I've seen, it does a little bit better job. But for me as a photographer that wants full ability to manipulate the final image, I don't like what's going on with the HDR in camera because you get JPEGs out of it. And I want the raw files when I work with my images.
It's so annoying too.
It is so annoying.
Can't they figure that out?
They will. That's the thing. I mean, our cameras will be probably fully HDR functionable in, I don't know, a few years, I would imagine.
I think you're right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's maybe why Adobe has not put a lot of effort into their HDR in Lightroom, because they know that probably the camera manufacturers are going to, you know, get that right. So, but you're right. But let's talk about the HDR. So there's a few different companies. The one that I've been using for a long time before Lightroom came out with their HDR was Photomatics by HDR Soft. And that was a company that did it's still a great software. It has a great anti-ghosting feature to it. So I still use it occasionally when I can't get Lightroom to work perfectly. But the only negative of this is that when you get the image from Photomatics, you're basically working with a 16-bit TIFF file and not a RAW file. So that's the only disadvantage. But it does have a great feature, ghosting feature to it. And this is a $99 software. Next software, HDR Effects Pro. That's free now for a time until somebody bought it. I can't remember who bought it from Google, but Google bought it from Nick and then made it free, but they weren't going to upgrade the software. And then somebody else purchased it. And so you might, in the future, you might have to pay for that down the road. But it's pretty good software. I don't think it's as good as Photomatics only because I haven't been able to, at least in the past versions, I haven't been able to look supernatural. This has a feature in it called Exposure Fusion Natural that makes it look natural, which is nice. But now we have the power to do a little HDR in Adobe Lightroom. And that's a huge advantage because now we can create, we can process the image after the merge has taken place and it's still a RAW file. So, but like I said in the beginning of our talk tonight is we want to use HDR to produce natural looking photographs, and in my mind this isn't natural. This looks more like what? Yeah, Thomas Kincaid. Yay! And this is easy to do. All you have to do is push one of the presets and you get this thing, which looks like a painting. This thing looks like a painting. So we're going to take a different approach to this HDR. So let's talk about the capture. Certainly, RAW file format has the best advantages, right, over JPEG. So use that. Do you need to use a tripod? Yeah, it's recommended. They have modes and features in these programs where they can auto-align things if you are hand-holding. But what happens is that you're cropping out some of the image when you do that because you can't ever hold the camera perfectly steady. And some people are better than others. But yeah, tripod is helpful. For the same reasons, a cable release is helpful as well. So you don't move the camera when you push the button. Aperture should remain constant. And you're going to exposure bracket with shutter speed. So this is the part that's really important. This is where we're going to get the details in the shadows and highlights so that we can merge the two photographs or more so that we can actually get the information that we need to see all those details in the shadows and highlights.
So is that always the case, or if you have a breeze blowing your foreground flowers, can you change the aperture instead and keep your shutter speed a little higher, or explain why?
They don't recommend that you do that because things change when you change the aperture in terms of what the camera is seeing. So all HDR programs recommend that you change in shutter speed. And
But you could start at a lower aperture to begin with and keep it smaller
keep it
aperture to
fast.
begin with, yeah.
Yep. But certainly if things were blowing, and that's a good point, before recently, software had difficult time with ghosting, like if flowers moved in between shots or trees were moving, it had a problem. Photomatics was pretty good, but it wasn't perfect. But now it's gotten better, and so, but it's still problematic. Lightroom isn't good. It only has 3 ghosting modes on it. So if you took 4 shots or 5 shots of flowers that were moving or trees or something, it might not get it all, possibly. I've had some problems when I processed. And that's why I used Photomatics. But as time goes on, it will probably get better and better. And it actually chooses, you know, in terms of the image, it will choose one so that those flowers remain sharp. And it doesn't, it neglects the other flowers that are in a different place. So it has gotten better. But that was one reason why people hung on to their split neutral density filters, because you only took one shot, and then you could manage that problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because I'm thinking if you want a high depth of field plus a faster shutter speed, you're kind of screwed without jacking up your ISO.
Right. Right, that's exactly. Well, you'd still have to shoot fast enough to get one of the flowers stopped.
Yeah.
So you might still have to adjust your ISO higher, right?
Yeah.
To get that.
Or move to a place where the wind doesn't blow like it does here.
Yeah, where is that place?
I don't know.
I've never seen that place. I think it's, I don't know where it might be. The wind always blows, but sometimes it doesn't occasionally, right? And then tag the first and last image. When you do a lot of these, which, you know, once you get this and you're doing it and you love it, you're going to be using it a lot, tag your first and last image, which means, you know, stick your hand in there or something, or put the lens cap on your first image and then take the shot and then go through the sequence and then stick your hand in for the very last shot, after your last shot, so that you know when you get on your computer, right, you know which ones to grab. Because if you're looking at a whole ton of, you know, in the grid mode or whatever, and you have a zillion of them, it becomes really difficult. So get in a good habit of tagging the first and last image.
Sorry.
Yeah.
If you do a lot of them, I found it's easier sometimes too. For the first photo, I take a picture of one finger. For the last photo, I take a picture of two fingers.
Brilliant. Did you hear that, you guys? He just, for his first shot, before he takes the one shot, the first shot, he just sticks a 1 in there. And for the last shot, after the last shot, I should say, he just sticks a 2 in there. And I usually go like this. I'm left and right-handed. So I go left for my first one and right. So left foot or right foot or whatever you do. But that's an easy way, 1 and 2. Then you know which ones to grab. Does that make sense? Okay. So all these are relatively important. So for those people that are shooting JPEGs, you can still do this. It's not that you can't do it, but you don't have the adjustability shooting JPEGs. So you know, if you can shoot the RAW, and certainly in Lightroom, RAW is the most important. But Photomatics will accommodate JPEGs as well. But anyway, shoot the RAW file format. Okay, so let's look at an exposure approach. And I'm going to give you a few different approaches here. You can decide on which is best for you. There's a lot of ways to do this, but this is the most challenging thing about the whole process. The whole workflow. Processing the files is easy, but to get the right files is the challenge. So let's go through these capture approaches, workflows, and you can decide on which is good for you. So first, in this approach, we want to meter the highlight and the shadow. What does that mean, meter the highlight and the shadow?
That's what we were doing before, you know, just using your spot.
Spot meter, that's exactly right. Spot metering the highlight, placing it where it should be, looking at the shadow, placing it where it should be, and that'll give you a reference. So we're going to walk through all these approaches so that you have a clear sense of what I'm talking about. But metering both of these highlights and shadows, it determines the number of stops you need to render the detail in both. Meaning it determines the number of shots you need to take to render detail in both. Okay, so here's a scene, and then we're going to walk through this. How many people have never approached their spot meter before? All right, spot metering is it just meters one little area. Nothing else matters around that little area. So if I was to put my spot meter up in here, and your spot meter is pretty darn small, right? And you can move it anywhere that you want. I put my spot meter right up in here to the brightness. This is the brightest area. I can't meter the sun. So I'm going to put it up there, and here I'm just going to open up a stop and a half. Is everybody with me? And so we're getting the first exposure for the highlight, and that's what I always do. I go immediately to the highlight to manage that. And it says that that exposure is 1/30 of a second. We don't care about what my aperture is in this case. We're just worried about the shutter speed. All right, so now we have one exposure, 1/30, and now we need to meter the shadow. And so if I meter this tree right here, that's the shadow that's the most important in my view, and just bring the exposure down to -1.5. Would everybody agree that that's a nice rich shadow, but it has detail in it? Because it's at -1.5, it's not down here at -2 or beyond, right? Okay, so now our exposure for that at -1.5 is 1/2 of a second. So we need 1/30. What else do we need? We need to get to 1/2. Well, a 15th, yeah. If you were working in full stops, 30th, 15th, an 1/8, a 1/4, and 1/2. So you would take 5 shots to get this exposure. This basically method is you can still do this, but now the software is so good that all of them recommend that you shoot in 2 full stops. You don't have to shoot in full stops. So that means less photographs so that you can shoot faster and you don't have to put as many on your drives, your cards and what have you. So let's look at that. So we meter for the highlight and shadow. We determined that our highlight was at 1/30 and our shadow was at 1/2. Is everybody with me? Okay. So then our sequence in 2 stops is 1/30 and 1/8 and 1/2. And now we have our pictures, right? And so now we could consider auto or manually bracketing this sequence. So you have an auto feature. You might not know it if you've never used that before, but basically once you set it, you can just hold the button down and it goes and takes all 3 shots and changes the exposure for you. That's pretty nice. That's really nice, right?
I find in Lightroom, if you shoot in threes like that, and then you take your Lightroom, your grid, you can get all your shots to line up, one below another, by highlighting them and then load them into a 3-wide bay.
Uh-huh.
It's convenient. Like you can just shoot like 60 HDR shots, but then they'll all line up. You can see them in threesies. As long as you're shooting consistently threesies and you don't pop off inadvertent shots.
Okay, yeah, I'm not fully understanding that. You can.
So when you open up your grid,
Uh-huh.
you make sure that you isolate them.
Oh, just so you have 3 across.
That's right, and then there'll be 3, 3, 3, 3, 3. You can see all your shots in bands. So
All
I find
right.
that handy because I do shoot in auto bracketing.
I see. I want to see your garage. I bet it's very organized. But no, that makes sense if you're just shooting in 3. Sometimes you have to shoot more though, and sometimes you have to shoot less.
Yes.
Sometimes it's only 2 and sometimes it might be 4 or more. You see what I mean? So that might create another challenge. But still, don't forget to tag in that way you know. And certainly there might be a lot of cases where you're just shooting 3 shots. That's exactly right. Yep. Just make sure you got the information. That's the most important thing. All right, so let's do that. Here's a 1/30. We know what we're shooting. Now we just need to change the camera settings. There's a 1/30 for the highlight. Open up to an 1/8. Open up to a 1/2. Have the shots. Now we just need to merge them. Oh, we'll merge them later. Well, let's talk about auto bracketing. That was a manual bracket. Here's an auto bracket in 2 full stops. So most cameras, not all of them, some of them can go just to the minus or plus side or minus side. But a lot of cameras, you have to start with the middle value, and then it'll take an exposure 2 stops darker and 2 stops brighter. So you would set the auto bracket at an 1/8. Is everybody with me? And then when you go 3 shots, it closes down 2 stops and opens up 2 stops. Still, we're getting to the same place. We have to get these shots because that's what we metered for. Is everybody with me? Okay. And that's helpful because if you do this, because then the auto bracket feature, you can put it on continuous shooting mode, high speed, and basically take 3 shots in a second or less, right? And it takes all the shots. Why would that be an advantage as to manually adjusting the dial? Yeah, if something was moving. So if clouds were, tended to move or something, then the auto feature is a real advantage, unless you're the rifleman of exposure adjustment, something like that. Is everybody with me on that? Okay.
And then if you're auto bracketing, do you have to put it on shutter priority to
No.
bracket with the shutter?
No.
Okay, it'll do it when you're.
If you're in manual mode, it brackets in shutter speed.
Okay. What if
Yeah.
you're in
You don't want
aperture
to. You don't want to be in shutter priority because then it would bracket in aperture.
priority? Okay,
But if you're in aperture priority, it brackets in shutter speed.
okay, gotcha.
Yeah. So you're all okay there.
That was confusing me for a minute.
Yeah. Oh, good. All right. So that's kind of the second method to do the workflow in terms of getting the exposure. I do this, and I find this really easy, and it takes all the math out of it, and I don't have to think too much, which I don't like to think too much, if I can help it. But what I do is just meter the highlight, and in this case, with that tree barn scene, the exposure was a 30th. Did everybody agree? Yeah. And then I just open up, watching the histogram as I shoot until I get detail in the shadows. And that's what I do. And sometimes I'll auto bracket. My Nikon camera can auto bracket just to the plus side, opening up, and I can shoot 5 shots, and then if I don't need the 5th one, I'll throw it away or whatever. But I just don't want to think. So I do it this way. I mean, you could meter the shadow. I never do this, and then close down until the histogram shows you have detail in the highlights. You could do it that way, but I never meter the shadows. I don't do it that way. I just go for the highlights, then open up for the shadows. So let's look at that. Here's the histogram, and now here's my first shot with my highlight here. And now, as I shoot, if you're in the right mode in your camera, you can just watch the histogram and watch the exposure change. And I just go and watch it go, and then get the exposure. So here's how I do it. And if you have time, like this thing, nothing is moving, so I actually did it manually. I just adjusted the dial. Had one hand on the cable release and one hand near the dial, and I went shoot, click, click, shoot, click, click, shoot. And that was my shooting. Does that make sense? So here's my second shot. Still, we need a third one, right? So there's my third one. And you can see, as we go through this sequence, metered for the highlight, shadows blocked up, right everybody? Open up. Now we're clipping the highlight. Does everybody see that? See the little black line coming up here? It's a little difficult in the dimness of this. But my shadow's still a little blocked, so yeah, I would take another shot just to bring that shadow up. Get lots of detail in that shadow. I can always bring the shadow down later in post-processing, right? Everybody with me? So that's how I do it. And then here's the merge of those 3 with a little cropping. All the detail in the shadows, nice detail in this tree, right here, and nice detail in color in the sky and around the sun. All right, let's look at a couple of examples here. So here I metered for the highlight. Where do you think that is? I just put my spot meter right here. And I think I opened up a stop, my initial exposure on that highlight. And now, once again, I'm just watching the histogram. This is a histogram out of Lightroom, so that's why it's so colorful, but still the same thing. So here, opening up, 2, open up 2 more. So now I've opened up 4 stops from my original exposure. And then there's the merge. And that's this one is in, I think I did this one in Nick, HDR Effects Pro. And look, the shadows are blocked up because in processing, I wanted them to be blocked up. But here's another version in Photomatics where the shadows aren't blocked up. The idea is that you can do what you want because you have the information, but you have to get the information. And that's what HDR, that's the process of HDR in camera, is getting all that stuff, all the good stuff that you want. Does that make sense? And you could do that just looking at the histogram. You don't even have to think about f-stops and shutter speeds, right? Or just shutter speeds. You could just click. Well, you got to make sure you're in the right sequence, but you don't have to worry about it too much. All right. So here's a kind of an example of some thought in the field. Here I love the composition, but this exposure, in terms of, because this is all in brightness, the exposure's fast, so the water isn't that silky that I like, right? That silky cotton candy look. I could use a neutral density filter to get that, but what I also wanted was really soft light on the foreground here. And so how do you do that? You wait for what? A cloud. So I waited for 45 minutes for a cloud to come over, had a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, whatever. And all of a sudden, yeah, here comes my cloud. And when the cloud came over, that's the histogram, everything is managed fine. But when the cloud comes over, then what happens? My exposure didn't change. Still, I'm exposing for this. But what is happening with the shadow? And now it's time for what? HDR. It's time to take more exposures and then merge them. Right, everybody? So I open up 2 stops, and I just have 2 exposures, then blend them together. And here, the second is, with a shadow there, I get my water to look the way I want, right? So that's perfect. And then the merge, and here I get everything that I want. Soft light on the foreground, long exposure for the water, but I had to do HDR to get there. Because remember when we talked about making the exposure bright for a raw file, if you have wiggle room? Well, in this case, there's no wiggle room. Do you guys see that? There's no wiggle room. I can't brighten this exposure up because I'd lose detail here. So have to go to HDR in this case. Maybe a split could work here, but right along here, right along this area. But HDR was, has taken the place of those splits in a lot of cases.
So this isn't the final, right?
This is the final.
Final.
Yeah.
So would there be a way to lighten up everything in there except for the sky?
Yeah, you can brighten up everything. You got the information, right?
Okay.
So she's saying, now can you brighten things up? And yes, you certainly do. And that's what's so nice about Lightroom right now, is basically you have a DNG file. So you have all this information. And I'm going to show you when we get into the program how much more stuff you have to work with. Yeah, we'll look at that. But I accomplished what I wanted to accomplish with HDR in this situation. And I turned it into a black and white. Oh, the ghosting, that's right. And so here, the ghosting feature, I worked this in Lightroom in different modes in terms of the ghosting feature, which we'll look at when we get to the processing. But here's just different versions of the low, medium, and high. So you can see that the water's changing, nothing else. Here's another version, right? And this is a faster shutter speed, so it's choosing one of the images with the faster shutter speed. So somebody made a comment, it was Doug, about wildlife. He shoots wildlife. And so you could use this for wildlife too, in terms of like if you're shooting in those situations where you have high contrast, because the ghosting would take care of the animal if it was moving, right? So you could easily do this with HDR and wildlife. So yeah, that's the one I chose. And in terms of the ghost. And then this one I just made it into a black and white. Now I did brighten up the foreground in this one, right? Certainly. All right, so here's some resources that you can just jot down. Tim Cooper, he's an instructor for the school. He's done a really nice ebook called The Realistic HDR Image. It's $9, so that's a really economical, good value in terms of an ebook. And these are books that cost, you know, they're about 25 bucks, but I found them really useful when I was learning. So Harold Davis's The Complete Guide to Creating HDR Photos and Practical HDR by David Nightingale. Okay, I'm just going to leave that up for just a minute. Any questions about how to get the exposures? One thing that I think people learning to begin with is that they look at a scene and it doesn't require HDR, but they try to make it an HDR image. And I've heard of even people going into processing and darkening an image and brightening an image just to create the HDR. Well, that's completely unnecessary. You already have the file. Do you see what I mean? And so that's one of the, I think, the easiest traps to get into is you see a scene and you say it needs to be HDR when it really, really doesn't. Like those images before that I showed you that I just brightened up the exposure, like the crater one. I just brightened up the exposure just to bring the shadows up. I didn't need to do HDR. Does that make sense to everybody? Any questions about, you know, how you might approach it? Because all of you are at different levels of your ability to meter, and some of us haven't even looked at a histogram before, which now you will. What's your name?
Dan.
Dan. Now he's going to go home and he'll find his histogram, and that'll really help you when you go to start looking at your image and its exposure. Because we can't just trust the image on the back of the LCD, can we? No, we have to look at the histogram. That's the truth. There is the histogram in terms of exposure, right? What else can give you an indication that you're at least losing detail in the highlights in a camera? The blinkies, the highlight alert warning, right? It's just like, you silly person, you overexposed this, you're losing detail in the highlights. Have you seen that? The blinkies? Yeah, that's one indication. Why don't they give the blinkies for shadows? I haven't seen one camera that has ever showed you the blinkies for the shadows. Why is that?
When it goes black, sometimes it'll show blue. You can put it in a mode where everything that's either blown out in either direction, it'll just show red or blue.
Oh, in your camera? Oh, okay, cool. What camera is that? Is that a mirrorless?
I've had some old Nikons that did that. They were the early digital ones, the Coolpixes. And,
Oh, wow. See, I've never seen that.
they might have done it because they were relatively primitive back then.
Maybe so.
Well, they didn't have much dynamic range, so you were
Always clipping something. But why do you think, just generally, why don't they give you an alert warning for shadows? Which we could use in our cameras if you were going to go by that. It's because shadows are less important. Most people, a shadow could be pure black without any detail, and it wouldn't matter one iota. But if your highlight has lost detail, like in something important like a wedding dress or a cloud, then it's like, oh my gosh, you need to know that. But with this, in terms of HDR, we need to know both, right? We need to see both, that we have detail in both highlights and shadows. Right, everybody? So whether you're just paying attention to the histogram, whether you meter and then get the exposure for shadows and highlights, or whether you do it like I do it, just meter for the highlight, open up for the shadows, looking at the histogram, the important thing is you get those shots. Because if you don't get the detail, then it won't be there in the final product, so to speak. Right? So that's the important thing. So I'll make sure everybody's good in terms of that, whether they do it one way or another. Feel pretty confident that you could pull that off? Okay. How many people are working in Elements? Elements, okay. And Elements has an HDR program in it. I'm not sure if you get a raw file out of it or not. I tried to look on the internet today. I have Elements, but my version is older, and so I wasn't able to tell that. So have you seen that in Elements?
I bought the latest version, but I haven't used it yet. I've been using the older version that doesn't have it.
Okay, so yeah, the new version has it.
Okay.
So you might explore that.
Okay.
How many people using Lightroom? So, okay. So that's going to be what I'm going to be showing is Lightroom. And you, how do you view files? Oh, you got it. Okay. Well, you're going to be able to see how to do that. And you know, the thing about YouTube, which YouTube is we're on now, but YouTube is so fantastic in terms of little things like that. You could just go in and say workflow HDR in Lightroom and get a 5-minute video, and it'll walk you through it for review. Do you know what I mean? That's what's so awesome. So we're going to switch a little gear here and jump into the program. So let me bear with me just 1 minute. And come on. Hello. Oh, it says I'm not plugged in, but I know that I am. Huh?
Oh, that your power's not attached, or?
Yeah, it's not I don't have the light. Oh, I'm not plugged in. So now, oh, and it's just about to die. So now I know exactly how long my Mac laptop functions with Keynote open because it was just about to die. And I think it may have. That's so funny. The best laid plans, right? It's like Murphy is constantly with us. How many people are working with an older version of Lightroom? Oh, thank you.
I need that light back on.
Oh, you do? Oh, I'm sorry. You remember, do you remember that Broadway show, was it Spider-Man? It took like 8 weeks or something. They had all kinds of problems.
I think that was it, yeah.
Was it Spider-Man?
There was a Spider-Man and it didn't, had
Yeah.
all sorts of
Yeah, they had delays of like 8 weeks.
Yeah.
So if we have a delay of like 4 or 5 minutes, we're doing better than Broadway in New York. Okay.
So I've got the Lightroom 6, which
6
apparently
has
they're
it.
abandoned, but
Yeah.
it's not the subscription, but that does have it.
It does have it. Yeah, Lightroom 5 does not, but Lightroom 6 did. So you're in good shape.
Lightroom is split now, and I'm concerned. I'm on Classic because I don't want to can't put everything in the cloud, and I'm worried that.
Well, Classic they're going to have that for a long time. It's the standard desktop for most of us.
Well, I know. I'm just kind of worried that they might become so enamored with the cloud.
No, they won't.
That's my worry.
They won't. No, I don't anticipate that at all, because most people are going to be using the Classic version because their files exist on hard drives and all those things.
But they're saying
Yeah.
the other one is like the Premiere one is kind of like.
I would not lose any sleep over that right now. I think we're okay for a while. Okay, let's get this fired up. We're almost there. So we just got through the hardest part, right? Which is
Powering up your computer again.
well, getting the exposures in your camera. That's the biggest challenge. The software is easy. Okay, I think no, we're not mirrored yet. It's still trying to wake up from its little nap that it took. Oh, it's not. Oh, you just unplugged me, Andy.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
I swore I unplugged the iMac.
I don't know. I don't know which one to unplug.
Don't worry about it. I swore I unplugged the iMac.
Oh,
Didn't need that. That's too funny.
what's what can I unplug here?
I got it.
Okay,
You get back up there.
that's hilarious.
Well, like this one-
Remember, Spider-Man, 8 weeks.
All right, make sure you got power.
Okay, should come on. That is funny. I mean, God, we were here for like 45 minutes before just to make sure we had everything. And you know how things are.
That's where all the power went.
Yeah.
45 minutes before you showed up right on time, you'd still have battery.
That's true. Oh, it's great. Any questions? Are your brains spinning? Some people? Not yet.
I guess you had mentioned you had mentioned that the kind of like that sometimes it is perfectly fine in camera, and and as kind of like the kind of like the flaw with the beginning photographer of using it when they don't need to, and I guess
Yeah.
I guess what's the harm if they in that, or is it just kind of wasting?
Say that question again.
I guess.
What's the harm of?
Like if a photo is has adequate range
Uh-huh.
without doing the HDR,
Yeah.
and yet you put it through the processing anyway in Lightroom. Is there a negative to that, or is
It would squawk at you. It might say your exposures aren't
varied enough?
yeah, varied enough so that go back and choose the right exposures. I've seen that warning come up. Yeah. So if you took two that were a half stop apart, something like that.
I have a question that's
Yeah.
kind of a follow-up to yours. So I shoot RAWs plus JPEGs most of the time, even though the RAWs are the only things usually that come into Lightroom. But do you ever, and so in that scenario, is there any value to doing an in-camera HDR picture when you're out in the field so you can kind of look at it and go, yeah, I think I could improve this.
Uh-huh.
And then doing the manual HDR so that you have those raw files to work with when you get home. So do you ever use the in-camera part just for like a preview test kind of thing?
No, I don't. In fact, I tried it that one time where I shot that silly window out of my house with the roof, and I never used it again. I just wanted to try it. Yeah, because I process everything, and I just shoot raw, and so I would never want a JPEG out of that.
Well, I'm just thinking it's kind of like when we took a black and white class and she had us shoot in black and white, which means only the JPEGs are black and white.
Uh-huh.
But it helps you visualize and compose and learn to see in black and white when you're looking through your camera, even though in the end you're going to get raw files.
Oh, yeah, that's
what I'm saying. Not to use that as the final product, but just to kind of see. Well, I wonder what this would do with HDR, and go.
Sure.
Oh yeah, well then
Sure.
I'm going to take a sequence and to have the raws.
Yeah, sure.
I don't
In
care
terms of
about that
while
JPEG,
you're
it's
learning.
a test, just
Yeah.
like with black and white. Well, they're black and white JPEGs. I can throw those away and work with the raws. if
Yeah,
I want.
I think that's totally appropriate.
Okay.
Definitely. At some point you might say I don't need to do that anymore. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Anyway, okay. Let's look at these files here. We'll just do this one, and let's look at the histogram first. I'll get that up over here.
Hey Doug, can I
Yeah.
jump in while you're talking? When you get a question from the audience, can you repeat it on when you say it so that people online can hear it?
Yeah, I couldn't do that one because it went so long. I wasn't sure, but thank you, Sarah. I appreciate that. Yes, I'll try to remember that. All right, so here's our and we're in double screen mode, right? Lightroom opened up with a, we need to get rid of that. There we go. And you guys still aren't seeing what I'm seeing. So we got to we're almost there.
Don't unplug it again. That's not me.
Yeah.
That should be good.
Yeah,
Yeah, there you go.
okay. Thank you. Okay. So here's a sequence, and as you can see, let's make this big so we can see that. And it's these 3 files. This one on the left down here, and this one. And if we look at this one, you can see that the histogram, I just metered for what, you guys? Yeah, I just metered out here. Probably something pastel blue, or maybe even this. This is an average tone right here. And so there's our exposure. And certainly it's like +1 here on the brightest area of the photograph here. And here we're blocked up a little bit. So we just need to open up, don't we? And let's just do one thing here. Get the our view option with, oh, let's see if we got that. I'm sorry. Our exposure is a 45th of a second. So that's the first exposure. And now if we open up, our next exposure is a 10th, right? 45th to a 10th is 2 stops. And here, you know, the shadow is close. So don't be afraid to push it even more. Here it's touching the edge. We got all the information in this second shot. But let's just go one more to get even more information. So then that we're at a 1/4 of a second on that one, or a 1/3 of a second. So that's another 2 stops. So this is how easy it is in terms of the software. You can come up here. Get out of this for just a sec. And go to Photo, and then Photo Merge to HDR right there. That's how to go from the main
You're in the
library up here. I'm in the library, yep. You don't need to be in the library, but you could also right-click, and that's just a shortcut to get to this menu, and then you go to Photo Merge to HDR.
Which program is this?
We're in Lightroom right now. Yep, and we're in the library module. So let's just click on that, and it's going to open up this other window called the HDR Merge Preview window, and it does it automatically for you. Now there's a couple settings up here. This auto align setting, if you're hand holding, it's good to make sure that's checked, and it's also going to crop the photograph for you because you can't keep things aligned. But then it has the auto settings, and right now, so it's making adjustments to the image to accommodate the highlights and shadows to take the best of both worlds. And so you'll see that once we get into the develop module, that all the settings will have changed if the auto settings are on. If they're off, it's going to look like this. See that? And so then you'll have to make all the adjustments yourself. So I like to just keep the auto settings on because then basically you can readjust them later, and you can see what Lightroom does to the photo. And then underneath that is the ghosting amount. And so you have none and then all the way up to high. And in this case, there's nothing has moved, so it wouldn't do anything. It's building the preview now, but it wouldn't really find anything that has moved, I don't think, because I didn't move, and certainly the landscape's not moving, right? So it's building the preview. And then down here is a little box that show the deghost overlay. So this is where it's choosing things that have moved in terms of what it's deghosting. And if we check that, so maybe I move the camera a little bit, possibly, right? Because it's finding a couple little things in there that have moved. I didn't think I moved. I was pretty stationary, but anyways, let's just go back to none. And that's basically all you do. You have those options for deghosting, and you'll be able to see what's moved. And then you just can choose auto align or choose the auto settings, and then you just hit merge. And that's it. It's that easy. And then the file will come back into Lightroom, and it'll situate itself near these. And it will have here's the file, and you can see that it has the sub title of the file called HDR, and it's a DNG file. DNG is Adobe's raw file format. So now you have all the ability to adjust the file. And I want to show you something about in terms of this. Why am I losing some of my, oh, I'm zoomed in. So if we go to this file, the HDR file, and go to the develop module, and sometimes you'll find that the shadows, the highlights might be too bright, the shadows might be too bright as well. So you have to go in there and process this a little bit. And I find the shadow just a little bit too bright. And you can see all the changes that have been made to the file that Lightroom did. See all the adjustments that it's made to the file to make it look pretty good? The algorithm in the background is working. And so it bumped up the shadows to plus 37. And I would just take those down a little bit. I think it's just a little bit too bright. Just make it feel like a shadow. You know, remember, we're trying to make it look as realistic as our eye sees it. But let's look at a regular file here, one that I just shot. That's that's a different sequence, or one of the files, the raw files from my camera. And if we were to adjust exposure here only, you can see, let me zoom in on this, that the exposure goes from -5 to +5, right? Well, the DNG file that was created in Lightroom, if we zoom in to this exposure slider, now it goes up to 10. So a lot more flexibility you can, in terms of, you know, some of these adjustments.
Is that just the merged file?
That is just the merged file.
Okay.
That is just the merged file.
Okay.
How much bigger in size is that file?
Well, it's a 16 megapixel. Let's see the difference. I don't know that. That's 16.2 as well. So it's no different in terms of the size. Let's look at another one. Let's look at this one in terms of the ghosting, because certainly, obviously, things have moved here because we're in the Yellowstone area, and that's a geyser with the steam has moved. And you can see as the exposure gets brighter, things are going to move, but let's look at the exposure first to make sure we got everything correct. So that was at a 60th of a second. That's a 30th of a second. So I shot this before, right? Before it got to 2 full stops. And so I'm just working in full stops, and that's okay too. The software is going to be fine with that as well. It just doesn't want you to go beyond 2. So there's a 60th of a second, 30th of a second, and things are moving. A 15th of a second. There's an 1/8 of a second. And a 1/4 of a second. So we don't need to choose all these, do we? We can skip. So I just took these 3 and skipped out on these 2. Right? Because I don't need them. But what if the steam was really cool in one of these? Then I could take all 5 and determine which part of the steam that I wanted. But let's just use these 3, and no, let's use them all and see what the steam looks like with all of them used. So photo merge to HDR with a right click, or you can go up to photo and go down to photo merge to HDR. All right. So this is a combination of all that steam, because we're on none with our deghosting amount. So you have to say to yourself, does it look good? You know, sometimes it might not look good, and then you can go to some of these ghosting amounts. And let's turn on the the show deghost overlay, just for a second to see what these different modes choose. Or different amounts choose, I should say. So that it was different. Did you guys see the steam change? And let's see where it is. So it's just choosing little sections of it right there. If you wanted to change the color of that, you can change the color as well. From red to green to white with the shortcut Shift-O changes the color. You can turn it off or on with just the O key if you use shortcuts. But I'm going to go to the red because I think that's a little bit easier to see. So let's go to the medium amount. And so you don't have too much control. Lightroom is doing this on its own. Where Photomatics, you're able to go in and choose exactly which photo you want the particular subject in. That's one of the benefits of that. But now it's choosing more, choosing some clouds, and going high. And certainly it's going to choose more of the motion that it sees. So it's choosing a lot there. And so now it's determining which files are being used for which motion that it sees. So that's how you can manually using the auto features in terms of the amount and choose which particular thing that you like. How easy is that, you guys? Right? It's easy. Super easy. And the beautiful thing is that, yeah, you get a DNG file, which is awesome because then you can kind of readjust. Let's look at this one and do this one real quick. There's exposure for the outside. So just walked up, spot metered this out here. And there's the end of the exposure right there, plus 1.5 out there. And like I said, when I'm shooting, I just watch the histogram. So just looking up there at this histogram and just shooting. There's this next one, open up some more. And I think I opened up one more. And this is working in full stops as well. So we could actually take just these three, because those are 2 full stops apart, right, everybody? And just use those. And photo merge to HDR. And I'm on high right now, which I didn't need to be. The buttons are sticky in Lightroom, so they will be there however you left them. When you hit merge, they will be there that way when you come back to it. And it's silly to think that, no, see, Lightroom didn't find anything moving in here because I was pretty good about that. So, but look, what do you think about the overall exposure here that Lightroom did? Let's merge this and come back into the program. So merge that. It'll show up here in your library again. Somewhere it'll jump in there. Is it down here? There it is. And let's see adjustments. It made all kinds of adjustments there. I think it brought the shadows up too high. Do you feel that like the contrast is a little bit low? Shadows don't feel too much like shadows. So I would process those down a little bit, take the shadows and turn those down. And the highlights look a little bright still too, so I take those down. And maybe seat your blacks. So I'm just hitting the Alt key as I adjust the blacks down, and that door is the first thing to go. So I'd want to probably hold off on that just a little bit, but seat that right there. And so here's the before and after. Right? And that looks pretty good. Don't you agree? Let's do another one where my friend, where is Betsy? Let's see if she was in here. Oh, it's right here. Okay, so here's the first exposure at a 3/50th of a second. You can see the highlight is once again managed, so I have detail in the highlights. And of course, Betsy's walking. She doesn't know I'm even shooting. And so she's going to take a step forward, and I'm going to open up 2 stops. And so that's the exposure. Now I have good detail in the shadows. And now, just can take those 2 shots and photo merge. And let's see how it handles this. Well, it actually did something there, right? So it actually removed Betsy automatically without the ghosting on, which is interesting. Normally you might see 2 ghosts there. But let's put it on low and see what the software's doing there. Oh yeah. Yeah, that's where she used to be. But what about medium? So it's constantly choosing the closest one first. So she's further in this shot, and that's just choosing a larger area. So, you know, it's a bit of a mystery how it chooses stuff from what I've seen, right? Oh, and that's interesting. Look at that. It was on high, and it chose to remove the one where Betsy's furthest in the shot, which I wouldn't expect. I would expect something different, but that's what you get. You just got to try all the stuff and then see what happens. Whereas if you do decide that, you know, you do this a lot and maybe you want to have a little bit more control, maybe you want to buy the Photomatics program. How many people own that in here? You love that Photomatics program?
Not as much as I used to.
Yeah, me too.
I can't make it look as natural as
Right.
Lightroom.
I can't either. Certainly, you can get close. But let's, did we merge this one? No. Let's merge this and compare this to Photomatics. We'll just do one. We have a little bit of time for that. And compare the 2. So, oh, it's still working. Still doing its thing. Here it is. Okay, so that's how that one looks. So let's go back, and now let's do Photomatics. And I'm not going to really get into this program too intensely, but I do want to show you some subtle differences. So here's Photomatics Pro. It's down in my sub-menu under Export. And this is that $100 program I was talking about by HDR Soft.
So does it come in as a plug-in for Lightroom?
It does. Yep. When you download it, it'll ask you, do you want to plug it into Lightroom? And sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. Just like anything, right? But it has a nice, easy box. You know, if you align images, if you're on a tripod, yes, good, great. Crop aligned results, fine. Show dialog with options to remove ghosts. Certainly that's the one that we want right now, right? And it has the ability to also reduce noise and chromatic aberration. So that may be nice if you don't do that in Lightroom or some other program. You want to choose those, but it allows the program to take a little bit longer, obviously because it's doing a little bit more processing. Yes, I want to automatically re-import into the library, right? And here you can add a suffix. I always put version numbers on them in case I do them differently every time. And you want output format. You have the options of JPEG, TIFF, 8-bit, and 16-bit. And so this is your name again? Peter was saying, yeah, you don't get a raw file out of this. You get a TIFF, a 16-bit. So you'd want to do all your work on that file before you actually bring it into this program. As opposed to Lightroom's HDR, you don't need to do a lot of work because it's a DNG file, so you can do that later. So that's another thing that makes it easier to use. Let's take this and just hit export. And whoa, Photomatics will open. If I can find, there it is. And it's in the ghosting feature right now. And I have over here, I just have it on selectively deghost. I'm going to actually show you what I was talking about. And you can see, if I didn't deghost, you'd see two Betsy's, right? Everybody? So, but in this program, you just circle what you want to take manage, and then control click inside to mark the selection, and then you control click again, and you can set another photograph. So you can choose where you'd want Betsy. So you have a little bit more options to be more selective in terms of your ghosting, as opposed to just allowing. So do we want her closer or further away? Doesn't matter.
If you're gonna compare it directly with the one you did in Lightroom, I thought it'd be closer.
Closer.
'Cause that's one-
That's what I just did, Herb. You're right, too. I think I just did that, didn't I? Yeah, I choose the one where she was closer. Wait. No, I didn't. Did I? Because the darker one was where she was closer. So we need to choose that one. And then let's just hit OK. And we're going to use the exposure, fusion, the natural to see how it compares to what we got out of Lightroom. So there it is. Come on. Okay, and it did choose Betsy as being close. And here's the tabs. You have tone mapping and exposure fusion. And this is natural. Here's some of those presets that you can, let's find the Thomas Kincaid one. It's over here somewhere. I don't even know where it is. Painterly? Ooh, what do you guys think about that? This is like the visual equivalent of a sour ball, as my friend Tim Cooper would say. So let's go back to Fusion Natural and just hit OK. Save and re-import. Now we have something to compare the two with. Is that the one you used frequently, is the Exposure Fusion Natural? Yeah. Yeah, and sometimes it's pretty good, sometimes it's not so good. Oh. Okay, it should be here somewhere. Is that it? No. Here it is. So the one on the right is Photomatix, and the one on the left is Lightroom. Can you guys see a difference? I can see a pretty big difference, huh? This one feels better to me. This one has a little more contrast. But this one, obviously, you can create the contrast if you want. With this other one, you're working with the 16-bit file and not the raw. Does that make sense?
The other one feels like you still clip it a little bit, the one on the right.
Ooh, let's check it out. No, not clipping. Nope, it has all the information. Do you see that? Yeah. Just bright. That's all it is. And you have, but you are working with the TIFF. So yeah, you could bring down the highlights and it's going to probably be okay, but like that. But you're much better off with the raw. So yeah.
Back to those super raws that I've read about how they get that. I mean, it goes beyond like the number of stops when they take 2 or 3 and they put them together. It's interesting the magic, the math, how they get those where you have those real wide ranges after you've taken multiples and stacks.
Yeah, like the exposure can go up to plus and minus 10. Yeah.
It's really interesting. I mean, the Adobe engineers really did some neat work on that.
Yeah, they're kind of smart. They're they might be a little smarter than me, maybe, that Thomas Knoll guy. All right, any questions, thoughts? For you, those of you who've never seen this or approached it, do you feel like you could do it? What would you need to do it? Software? You're just started in Lightroom? So you would need to just get into it, yeah? And you know, RMSP has an awesome 4-day class if you wanted to get into it. Somebody did, Doug, you went through the 4-day?
Yeah, 2 days.
2 days.
Lightroom.
Lightroom. And that, where was that? Tell people about that. Huh?
Bozeman last year.
Oh, Bozeman, a 2-day Lightroom program. But RMSP, I didn't know if that was with RMSP or.
Yeah, it was with.
Yeah.
Tim was the instructor.
Okay, perfect. Perfect class, relatively inexpensive, not much time. You could do it on a weekend and get the ball rolling. And I would really encourage that some way, because Lightroom can be, what everybody, for people that have used it. It can be tricky. You have to know what you're doing. You have to go through, you know, some certain things so you don't get all funky and losing files and things like that. You never, Lightroom won't delete files, but you can lose them. Like Lightroom doesn't recognize where they are, and so yeah, proper workflow is really important. But I think you would love it, the program, and you can see how easy it is once you're in here, just to do what you need to do in terms of that. Let's see if there's anything else here. In terms of processing, I don't think so. Look at this one. This is a huge one. Ooh, this is JPEG. Should we try this? This is JPEG's files, and certainly I think let's try this and just merge it in Photomatix and see what it turns out like. Normally, when you're using JPEG files, they tend to be a little bit crunchy, like, do you know what I mean? A little too sharpened, yeah, like it feels a little bit like too much contrast really close to edges and things like that. There's no ghosts here, so I'm going to turn that off.
If you merged those in Lightroom, would you get a DNG?
That's a good question. I've never done that.
Would that happen if your originals were JPEGs? I don't think.
It might tell you it's a DNG, but it's not gonna give you the actual editability.
It won't-
Yeah, you might have the DNG.
Package it that way.
Yeah, yep. So those are cropped differently, which is weird. And it gave me a little warning. So let's not use that one. But here's a JPEG right here. This is one of Tim's sequences. And that's a 45th, a 20th, and a 10th. So that's working in stops, right? Full stops. So we could actually take out this middle one because we don't need that. And just, let's go to HDR. Oh, that's JPEG. Let's try it. See what happens. Photo merge to HDR.
So if they're one stop apart, you would just skip the middle one and only use 2 stops?
Yeah. That's what all the software is recommending, all the HDR software, which is really nice because then you don't have to shoot as many files. Huh? Yeah, it didn't turn out too bad. Let's just merge that, and I think Forrest is right. I've never done JPEGs, but we're going to try it.
See if the slider ranges have increased. It would be kind of weird. Yeah, JPEG.
Say what was that? The files?
Slider.
Oh, the sliders.
See if it goes to 10.
Okay, so there we have it. There's the file. It's a DNG, and it goes to 10, both directions.
Yeah, so it packages it, but it doesn't have the information.
Yeah. Yeah, so you wouldn't, yeah, if you started to work on this, you'd really suffer after a bit. Like it even looks a little bit crunchy down in here almost. I can see it on my computer. It's a little challenging on there, but yeah, so the best is if you can shoot raw, certainly. And you're not seeing you're seeing your raw files, but not your JPEGs. Is that what you said?
Well, I import in generally just the raw files into Lightroom most.
Oh, okay.
I
You.
don't import the JPEGs.
Oh, okay. I see.
And depending on what I'm doing, I'll often later on throw the JPEGs away. Sometimes I keep them for
Okay, that's just
Depends
a
on the
choice.
camera and what I'm doing with it.
Yeah.
But like if I take pictures with my mirrorless camera, with the JPEGs, I can connect it to my phone and text somebody a picture, but if they're RAWs, the phone won't know what to do with it.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's why it's easier.
That's
for
why
me
you
to
make
do
that
both and
decision.
then throw away the JPEGs later,
Yeah, I see.
yeah.
Good. All right. Well, I think you guys are feeling good about it. If there's no questions, I think we're going to just wrap up.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
I always want to come up and say thank you to all of you for coming out tonight. Thank you for everybody watching on YouTube, and
Yeah.
nice work.
Thank you.
Yes,
Appreciate that, Andy.
absolutely, man.
Definitely.
Yeah.
All right.
And we got one more coming up in, is it 2 weeks or a month?
That's about a month, yeah.
1 month, we have one more free lecture coming up for all this series. So yeah, thank you everybody for coming. Thank you again, B&H, and if anybody likes it on YouTube, subscribe. You can see a lot more of our videos.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it, you guys.